For the past 2 weeks, alongside Armored Core 6, I've been playing one amazing indie game by the name of Sea of Stars. Sea of Stars is a love letter to the classic SNES RPG games, from its visuals to its soundtrack to the story, and, relating to the title of this video, the combat system. Unlike many of those classic games, Sea of Stars does something different with its take on turn-based combat, as it takes some of the best aspects that some games have and merges it into one really engaging combat system. Before I can go any further, we've got to look at the normal usage of turn-based combat and why, for the most part, it clicks so well with many players who love the genre. First up, why does turn-based combat work so well? So many role-playing games, in fact probably most role-playing games, use some variation of turn-based combat, from the classics to the modern games. From the very first Final Fantasy to Final Fantasy VII Remake that incorporated turn-based in a different way. As recently as Baldur's Gate 3, one of the biggest games of the year, is turn-based as well. The Pokémon games have kept using turn-based combat for decades, which might be because they don't want to innovate it as much, but I digress. It clearly works, and there's a big demographic for players who enjoy this form of combat. I think it mainly comes down to one element, which is the strategy. Turn-based games typically have a huge reliance on an elemental system within their games, where one element is stronger than another, whilst being weak to another. Pokémon has the easiest example. Fire is weak to water, water is weak to grass, and grass is weak to fire. It's a simple circle that introduces more elements later on, make it a bit more complicated, but it stays the same. The Persona series, you've got thunder attacks, physical attacks, and gun damage. Those are just two examples, but they do indicate that there is a level of strategy and complexity that can be applied here. By mastering the knowledge of what elements are strong against others and which they falter against, it leads the player to try as much as possible to capitalize on the strengths they can have. And because role-playing games have lots of ways to tinker with your character or party stats, from their attack, health, and magic defense for instance, the player thinks about what members have the highest possibility of being as effective against the opponent. And in some games, it's easier compared to others. Pokémon gives you 6 members in your party, leading for more options of customization, whereas in Final Fantasies, party members range from 3 to 4, giving the player more control, power, and most importantly, a higher stake and urgency in making sure that their party is best suited. Although there are other reasons as to why lots of players enjoy turn-based combat. As for one, it's a pretty simple combat system to implement. First, one player attacks, then the next one, maybe the opponent, and then back to the player again. And this leads to an unintentional problem that has been quite an issue for some players who might want to get into the genre, regardless of how deep the strategy involved might be: monotony. By constantly doing the same actions over and over again, using a possibly winning formula that guarantees victory all the time, players might find themselves bored. Sure, there might be great stories behind the games, but if the core combat isn't clicking with them, chances are they will be dropping off the game pretty quick. And sometimes, more common in older generations of role-playing games, the game is just slow. Animations take a lot longer and are unskippable at times. I mean, look at this attack from Final Fantasy VII's final boss fight against Sephiroth, Supernova. This move, it's like, what, 2 decades long? Kidding, of course, it's actually just 2 minutes, but still pretty long. It still stands that if fights take longer than they should, it's just too much idle time and it just becomes monotonous, where you just wait to press buttons to get back into the game again. And this is where I think a lot of people have issues with classic RPGs using the turn-based formula: random encounters. Now, I can justify random encounters to an extent. For one, it always keeps the players on their toes and makes it easy to continuously level up if monsters are at the right level. But other than these 2 points, it's not that fun. For one, they are random. They can show up at any time in any area that looks like it could be a combat area. You enter a cave, random encounter. You want to swim on the ocean, random encounter. More common than not, the enemies from random encounters are also typically lower level than you, meaning that they don't give much experience points to level up or pose much of a challenge to keep you invested, making them simply become roadblocks on the journey, adding to this monotonous feeling. I've got to say, I love Pokémon Platinum. It's one of my favorite childhood games, but that game runs at a snail's pace. If I see one more Zubat or have to fight Chansey, I just can't. Or the frog spells in Final Fantasy VII that just keep you stun-locked in a sense as a frog. It's just not fun at times. And that brings us to the solution: the remedies and changes that have been applied to turn-based combat, and why Sea of Stars is probably one of the best implementations of it. Sea of Stars has 3 elements that make this combat system a blast to play through, where some of these are also a part of other games that have implemented this previously. Sea of Stars has the necessary strategy for each battle, the removal of random encounters, and the engagement of the player in every single battle. I think we can start off with how it rigs the random encounters. Like many modern RPGs, Chrono Trigger inspired games to have enemies in the overworld, meaning you get to choose which fights you have to take, or if you want to skip them. Of course, you got to dodge them in the overworld, but giving the player a choice of which encounters to take is a huge bonus, as it creates an urgency. You can even deal bonus damage to enemies in the overworld, like jumping on them in Super Mario RPG, surprise attacks in Persona 5, or grappling onto them in the case of Sea of Stars, which is an added bonus as it adds to the engagement. Speaking of added engagement, Sea of Stars has button prompts that you can press at the right time to deal extra damage, mitigate the damage from enemies, and also keep combo moves going on longer. What this does is pretty simple yet highly effective, as it keeps the player invested in what is going on, always being a constant and active element in the game. And finally, the added strategy. Sea of Stars adds its own twist to the elemental chart. On top of the usual weaknesses that some enemy types have, enemies now have lock attacks. These are heavy attacks that deal massive damage or other significant effects, but these can be blocked completely. Enemies have a turn counter above their head, and lock attacks show what type of damage must be done in order to completely remove the attack that the enemy might perform. Maybe a simple enemy needs to be dealt dull lunar damage to block its effect, or a more complex one might require 4 solar attacks and 4 sharp attacks to completely remove it over the course of maybe 3 turns. This adds an insane amount of depth to the combat, and on top of that, the live mana system that can add elemental damage to regular attacks. Sea of Stars really has it all. There are also other examples of how other turn-based combat games make the combat more engaging. Final Fantasy VII Remake, primarily an action game, has active battle gauges that must be filled up in order to deal a stronger attack, which fills the role of a turn in this game. Or Persona 5, my favorite RPG of all time, makes the combat so engaging to participate in because the UI and art style and vibe of the game is just so gorgeous to look at. There are still many more examples of other turn-based games out there, and I haven't played them all. From Octopath Traveler and its turn counter, Xenoblade and its active MMO style attacks. There are a multitude of ways how turn-based combat has evolved. Sure, some of the older games might not have aged as well because of their combat, but so many newer games have just implemented better versions of the combat and upgraded it, and at times even made the stories better as well. In truth, I really just wanted to make this video because I wanted to gush about how good Sea of Stars is. It's really got it all, but if there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that Sea of Stars has got an amazing combat system, and that turn-based combat still rules, and I love it. And with that, welcome to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, a like means a lot, and a dislike too if you didn't enjoy the video, as both of these help me improve the content that I can make for this channel. So what are your thoughts on turn-based combat? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, and if you want to see more from me, a subscribe comes a long way and it really does mean a lot. So with that said, I'm going to keep on playing Baldur's Gate 3, which I just started a couple of days ago, but that's about it for me. Have a great rest of your day, night, and week, and with that, Storm out.